science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk, this podcast dedicated to advancing the frontier of architectural thinking. Today I am very happy to be bringing you the first part of a two-part series, which is an edited version of a webinar that I recently moderated entitled, "Is Mid-Century Indian Modernism Still Relevant?" Using my book on Aditya Prakash, One Continuous Line, The Art, Architecture and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash, as the starting point, this webinar engaged the question of the legacy and understanding and contemporary import of mid-century modernism in a cross-disciplinary forum. And that original webinar is available on YouTube. The link for that will be available for you on the Architecture Talk page. So the entire webinar has been published in a 5-part linked series. It's a great conversation with more to come. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Is mid-century Indian modernism still relevant today? When we look at the question of the legacy of mid-century modernism, and not just of India, but of the whole world, we are faced with a contradiction. On the one hand, it seems absolutely clear that the mid-century moment is long gone and past and become obsolete. We see this certainly in the architecture, when a lot of buildings of that era are being destroyed or reworked. But we also see this in the political sphere, where the politics and ethics of that era are considered to have run their course and become obsolete and a thing of the past. But on the other hand, when we look at some of the aesthetic production of that era, we find that the art and, for instance, the furniture of the mid-century moment is greatly treasured and sold and collected and possessed in museums and collections around the world for fantastic prices. And it is also true that as we face the climate crisis and the other environmental challenges that we are confronting today, the mid-century obsession with thinking about the energy crisis, we're thinking about new ways of building and living. We're thinking from a high altitude about how human civilization could be organized. That question of large-scale planning seems to increasingly again be coming to the fore as we try and imagine a future in which we are living in a manner that is harmonious with the exigencies of our planet. In other words, the jury on the relevance of mid-century modernism is still out. We will use my recently published book, One Continuous Line, The Art, Architecture and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash as a starting point, but our conversation should be wide-ranging and hopefully interesting and provocative. On this topic of is mid-century modernism relevant today, I'm joined by 4 fantastic scholars. Anthony Vidler is professor and dean emeritus of the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture of the Cooper Union. He's a historian and a critic of modern and contemporary architecture and has published widely from the French Enlightenment to the present, which includes an extensive array of books from topics like the architectural uncanny, warped spaces, and histories of the immediate present. And second on the panel is Mark Jarzombek, professor of history and theory at the MIT School of Architecture. Mark is today one of the leading advocates of global history and is also
published prolifically. He has written a lot of books and papers, including, of course, the groundbreaking textbook, A Global History of Architecture, which, of course, I've had the great pleasure of co-authoring with Mark amongst the many projects that we have worked on together. Next on my list over here is Partha Mitter. Partha is, of course, well known in the art history circles. He's Professor Emeritus of the University of Sussex. He's a historian of art and culture, specializing in the reception of Indian art in the West, and most recently in global modernism. Of course, some of his texts are iconic and well established in the history of South Asian art history. Amongst these, from his long list of publications, I want to in particular point out his book, 1977 book, Much Maligned Monsters, which inaugurated a whole genre, I would argue, of colonial and post-colonial art history scholarship. But of course, his recent work on cosmopolitanism and related issues is something that we will be probably taking up a lot more now. And finally, we have Sunil Khilnani. He's professor of politics and history now at Ashoka University. He's the scholar of Indian history and, of course, very well known, but perhaps best known as the author of The Idea of India, which became a bestseller. And I remember I first encountered it in the railway stations of India. So that's when I picked up the idea of India. And I thought, oh yeah, I get what he's talking about. And that became a book which was very well established. So is mid-century Indian modernism or mid-century modernism in general relevant today? That's the question. We are trying to put, I suppose, a comparison between a aesthetic, social, and political effort that can be said to have occurred not just in India, but around the world, roughly, let's say, from 1950 to 1970-ish. And we are trying to ask that today, in the second decade of the 21st century, is that moment 50, 60 years ago of any continued relevance? And this question, of course, comes up because, of course, a lot of mid-century architecture is being destroyed today for questions of obsolescence and also questions of political interests of various kinds. So should we preserve a few buildings and how should we preserve them? And what indeed is the legacy of that moment is the question at hand. And I want to begin off by having set these two moments up. I thought one way to begin is, I remember growing up between those two moments in India in the 1970s, all right? And in India in the 70s, two things seemed very strong. One was that modernism, modern architecture in particular, seemed to be under attack, or rather, it was not under attack, but it was being strongly critiqued by a series of postmodern imperatives, right? There was this critique of its aesthetics and its claim to universality. And there was a critique of sociality, of its location. And today, in 2021, there is a different kind of a critique of mid-century and early modernism. So I wonder if that's a good place to begin, at least in the architectural sphere. And of course, then we can turn in a moment to the political sphere, which also was under critique in the 70s and 80s. What, Tony, do you think is the difference between the 70s moment, and I invite, I've already told all the panelists, feel free to join in as you like. What do you think is the difference between that moment in the 70s? What was those critiques of modernism about as compared to what we perhaps are seeing today?
Well, I have to say that the critique of modernism, in my experience, was an emerging phenomenon, certainly in Britain, almost immediately after the close of the Second World War. It was a critique which was based on a critique of technology, the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. It was a critique that began to evaluate socially the questions of exclusion and zoning built into the CIAM, or the Congress of International Modern Architecture, Athens Charter. It was a critique that felt that the reductivist aesthetics of the immediate pre-war period, the abstractionist aesthetics, were not involved in anything to do with popular appreciation. And that critique, I think, built out of Team 10 with the Smithsons, and out of a whole range of questions that, on the one hand, criticized the technological enthusiasm of modernity, certainly with the Smithsons, and certainly with a lot of architects who began to look more at the materials of construction. And then there was a critique that the technological aspirations of modernity hadn't been satisfied. So we have people like Rayner Banham and Buckminster Fuller and Cedric Price in Britain. So the critiques that you received in India in the 70s had already been well, if you like, formulated by the 70s, and were at the same time being inflected by an aesthetic critique of one form of abstraction or another, whether it was brutalist abstraction or modernist abstraction, which began to look at the ways that architecture might connect more to its own history. And so we get the historicizing postmodernisms that Baird and Jenks proposed in their 67 Meaning in Architecture book. So I think that there are two stages to the critique. And I think neither of them were deeply involved in the kinds of critiques that we are involved in today. Neither of them seem to, except very peripherally, in terms of solar energy being experimented occasionally, but electricity was still thought of as the great boon of mankind.
As the solution, as the answer,
As the solution, and therefore there was no real critique of the infrastructural questions that now we talk about. There was no critique of the predominantly Western-based ideological framing of the practice of architecture, the discipline of architecture, and there was almost no critique at all of the neo-imperialist, post-imperial spread of Western architecture's disciplinary apparatus. So I think we have a lot to talk about, and especially in terms of the environment, where we had a very brief environmental fling in the 70s in Europe.
Early 70s,
during the gas crisis, but that went straight under the bridge in favor of historicist postmodernism.
Let's come to the climate and the energy crisis in a moment. But Partha, perhaps I can turn to you in a moment for a moment, if it's okay. And since Tony brought up this all these critiques of modernism, which were already in extant in the 50s, 60s, certainly from architecture, we think of Team 10 and so on. Often what we heard as a young student of architecture in the 70s, we were subjected to the idea, well, modernism, it was a Western import, right? A kind of a post-colonial, neo-colonial hangover of the Nehruvian era, and echoes of those ideas are all still present here today. What is your reading of that critique, and what is your reading of mid-century modernism, especially in terms of ideas? I think you have written about cosmopolitanism. I wonder if you want to pick up on that.
Okay, well, I see modernism as a discourse, a specific discourse, which emerged in late 19th century, early 20th century Europe, America a little later. But modernity is a wider issue. Now, there is an interesting connection, as we all know, between these vast changes communication revolution, travel, and other forms of, real great changes brought about by colonial rule, not directly by them often, but certainly the whole thing, the impetus got very strong at that time. Related to that, I want to make it a bit wider, also bring in the problem of, if we can call it art and architecture, they're, very related. Now,
for sure, yeah.
You see, what's interesting is that what you find that colonialism and nationalism are very closely woven. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah.
And the early period of 20th century, not the mid-century, but you have this sort of nationalist struggle and this kind of continuous interface of colonialism and nationalism, and it led to art and not so much architecture, if I'm correct, but you might correct me on that. But what then happens is very interesting. Let's take Nehruvian period, because that's where, we have
that's our focus. We definitely.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
What is interesting is that you have related to, let's say, Nehru's own dreams about a transforming society, which would be secular, modern, society, and leave all the previous terrible things behind. Now, the interesting thing about it is it has also links with science, the teleology, the continuous linear history, that it goes on and on, both in science and art. Both have tremendous problems, but let me not come to that yet. So this period, can I say that 47 is a very important date, not just for India. That is the beginning of the process of decolonization. And a whole lot of countries come into it. Shall we say 50s and 60s, because by 70s, a lot of critiques started happening. But this is I call it, it's a great optimistic period. Everything can happen, it's possible. So Nehru asked Corbusier to come to India. Well, there are also, tremendous kind of interest in America, particularly architects, I mean, so many as disciples of Lloyd Wright, and Joseph Allenstein, Ray and Charles Eames, they come in, they interact. This is a period where there is no questioning of the whole project of modernism. It's very, very forward-looking. There were unfortunate problems within that, and that is why by the 70s, greater critics start happening. But one thing I have to say, to my mind, late 70s is a very different period. Now, all the way from 47 to the late 60s, you have critiques of capitalism, but these are always within the Western teleological framework. There's no challenging. And postcolonialism, postmodernism begin to challenge that. And that actually has a lot of impact eventually on art and other aspects. Does that make sense? So the next period is a period of rethinking and kind of, that's another interesting period.
Right.
I mean,
but one of the interesting things, Partha, isn't it, that in the 50s and 60s, at the time, Tony, as you were saying, in a lot of Western discourse, there were significant critiques of modernism being launched, coming out of the complex experience of World War II. The interesting thing is, modernism, in a sense, modern architecture, takes off in Chandigarh, in Islamabad, in Dhaka, in Tel Aviv, in Brasilia, a little earlier, but also in, if you want, Canberra and Ankara. It sort of becomes an important thing as a part of the post-colonial world. So go ahead, Partha.
Yeah, well, the thing is that I do believe that these critiques were within the Western canon. There's no real questioning. It doesn't go beyond that. So you have a kind of hierarchy, which is challenged increasingly.
Yeah. What is the relationship between all these, let's say, Western critiques and the post-colonial, can we say, embrace of modernism? Is that a fair Are they just separated, or
I mean,
is there a
you only
connection?
mentioned postmodern, Jenks and others, but there's the post-colonial aspect. These are working, well, they take modernism and all the other aspects, and they critique, and the critiques are very different. But you see, before that, I mean, there are so many very important figures, Rosalind Krauss, for instance, challenging the idea of originality of the avant-garde. But they never actually grappled with the problem of non-West and its own issues. So that, I think, is a very fundamental difference from the late 70s, 80s.
And I think, Partha, you're absolutely right in saying that the critiques I talked about immediately after the war in Europe are totally within the Western canon. Absolutely. And they follow from your distinction between modernism and modernity. There was no question that the Smithsons, in criticizing Corbusier, were not criticizing the idea of a modern architecture. They still wanted a modern architecture. Yes. And all the way through, I think, we're having a big conference tomorrow on Alan Cahoon's criticism. And he was all the way through a modernist, even though he understood the incursions of a kind of historical nostalgia that were emerging in postmodernism. So the modernity was still there as a flag that should push architecture, no matter which way.
Yeah. Do you think that we are still living in the shadow of modernism by even rejecting it? It's there. I mean, it's in the background.
Before we turn to the immediate present, Sunil, we're sort of trying to bifurcate this division, Western and post-colonial. You have, of course, worked on the question of modernist nationalism, certainly in India, extensively. I mean, how do you see, from your perspective, from as a historian, the issue of mid-century nationalism and the post-colonial question? And if you can, how does it connect to art and architecture?
Sure. No, thank you. So I mean, perhaps rather than thinking about the moments of critique, one might just think about the different valuations of forms of modernism in India and how that's changed at different moments. And I mean, I guess what I would say and see is that, the way modernism comes to India is very much as through a cultural and political impulse. It's not driven by, for instance, changes in the industrial forms and structures of production, which are very important to the way modernism develops in the West. I mean, it's really in relation to industrial design and those sorts of imperatives that modernism starts to emerge. That's not the case in India. It's very much driven, and in that sense, it's an elite and very largely a state initiative that brings modernism to India. So it's the aesthetics and the politics which bring it, I think, to India. And that means that the kind of modernism that crystallizes in India is very different. And so if you take Chandigarh, I would say it's a kind of bureaucratic modernism that Chandigarh comes to represent. It's a form of modernism where the rest of society is actively insulated. As you know, Corbusier himself stipulated, this was a seat of government and administration. No industry, no manufacture, no real life of India should kind of contaminate the monumental structures of modernism. And then, in the introduction, in the sort of audiovisual, you had something about how, the furniture, the movable objects of modernism, the furniture, etc., suddenly took on this valuation through the market
recently.
And that's a moment I know well, because I was actually in Chandigarh in the 90s with some French dealers at the time. You saw this furniture, and it was essentially, government, it was all marked in white paint with government inventory numbers. It had this kind of, there was no aesthetic valuation given to it. It was a bureaucratic piece of instrumental use. And of course, the 90s was also a moment when India was opening to the market. And suddenly new kinds of furniture were available, new kinds of modern furniture. So there was this sense of, out with the old, Who wants this old wooden furniture? Let's get the new stuff that the market is bringing. So there was a kind of shift in that valuation. So I think that's a kind of more specific aspect to the question. There is a more general issue, which is really about India as a post-colonial new nation, what its valuation of and its relationship to its past is, both its intermediate past and also, above all, its recent past. That's to say, a past which has been dominated by colonialism, by the West, and beyond that, intermediately, the past in which the Mughals ruled. And what you see playing out today in India is a kind of anxiety, not just of influence, but an anxiety of what's seen as Western influence, and perhaps even influence that has come from the West. And so there's this kind of urge to erase that past, but it's an unease, because at the same time, there's a sense that that past is valuable, not least economically, for tourism, for other kinds of purposes. So there's a kind of almost a schizophrenic relationship. So you can destroy mosques because they are a kind of reminder, as you see it, to a kind of moment of your of injury and conquest. But at the same time, the Taj Mahal is like you don't want. I mean that's that's the kind of source of your tourism revenue. So I think there's two aspects to these changing valuations of the past, and of the objects that were created by the recent past.
It becomes a question of, what is trash and what is treasure, right? That becomes, in a sense, the preservation question as indexed to ideological and political questions, right? The anxiety of influence is politicized in many different ways. So how do you describe, the modernist, the Nehruvian moment's adoption of Western modernism? Is it as a political thing? Is this simply a matter of the cultural rooting of the Indian nationalist elites, or is it also an iteration of this question of influence and the anxiety of influence in different ways?
It's important to see that the kind of what we call Nehruvian modernism. The Nehruvian project was not simply a modernist one. It was a vastly plural one. And I think the important thing to remember is that, you mentioned Islamabad, Dhaka, Brasilia. These were capital cities that really were statements of the nation. Chandigarh was not a capital. Chandigarh was a state capital. And that was that in a sense, Nehru embraced the kind of past that existed within a city like Delhi and said it could be made Indian. But at the same time, he wanted the shock of a kind of modernism as well, not to erase what was already there, or not to kind of, he wanted it as part of a kind of multi-stranded reinvention of India, I think. So it wasn't a full commitment in that way. And I think it's important to see that, to nuance that, because he was also very sensitive to the past, to the heritage of the past, to the folkloric traditions, to the more popular traditions as well. I think this what he was trying to do, perhaps unsuccessfully, was to try and blend them into a more distinctive Indian approach, rather than to go all out for one. So, Chandigarh, as he said in one of his speeches, it's like a hammer blow for India. It was a sort of necessary shock that India needed in order to kind of
make
activate,
you think.
Yes, and to activate this kind of dormant intellectual and aesthetic, or suppressed intellectual and aesthetic capacities that had sort of been, pushed down by colonialism. So I think it was part of a broader strategy, of a plural project, both aesthetically and politically. And I think that's important.
Mark, what do you think, as an advocate of the global history in the field of, colonialism, post-colonial anxieties of influence on other sides, Indian nationalism, in this field, does this all in general as an overall field describe the mechanics of what you would call global modernism at work, or how would you describe this?
That's a great question, and I want to get my hand to that. But I'd like to go back before we turn page to the conversation preceding us about critique of modernism, which I find extremely fascinating. And to start off with, what comes to mind is a reference in your book where you talk about Aditya Prakash's work as negotiating the difference between things that look modern and them be modern, and look at or in quotations. And I read that and I had to put the book down because my head just went like that, and I really had to sort of try to understand what that means. It's an extremely simple sentence, but it's a very provocative one. And I tried to just sort of unpack it in the context of what you were writing and saying, and about now what I'm hearing, in this conversation, very wonderful conversation about critique. Because of course, to look modern privileges a sense of aestheticality, the opticality, the immediacy of something, even though it requires a certain type of learning of how to look. I understand that. But to be modern, actually also privilege something very different, which is has to do a lot with textuality, with writing, with reading and understanding and positioning yourself within the textual culture of modern, on the one hand, but also positioning yourself within the ontological culture of the modern, which is what you try to outline in the continuous line, right? That that your father was modern, right? Whether no matter what he did, it was modern because of his ontological position in the framework, including whatever critiques and experimentalities that might embrace, right? So a very broad range of realities that are much broader than just sort of the look. And you try to both honor his attempt to put these together, but you, every 5 or 6 pages, sort of throw in the idea that there's this line, but also there's this weird shadow, where the line actually is a bit more troubling than one thinks. And this particular moment is where you sort of talk about the theater, and there's a truss in the theater, and wanted the truss to be visible and seen because he's modern, and that's the way it was. And Corbusier comes and said, yes, that's great. But then the local guys wanted the hung ceiling, and then come the restorers recently, and they put in the hung ceiling. So the question is, which is more modern, right? Is the hung ceiling really not just as modern as the truss? After all, I mean, yes, we can be seduced by the fact that the moderns, the real moderns, wanted it to be seen and visible. But there's this other modern, which is the modern of, it just has to look modern, and that's good enough. And so the hung ceiling might be absolutely something one wants to embrace, because it's just another way of doing modern in a different syntax, in a different culture. And so that's where, and you sort of are a little bit negative about the hung ceiling, understandably, but you don't actually necessarily come out and critique it as necessarily an evil either. So, you leave it so preservationists have to sort of puzzle this thing out as they necessarily should, and maybe they could put windows in the hung ceiling so you can have the ceiling, but also have these plexiglass.
But see it also. Yeah, that's kind of like a postmodern. Yeah, I mean, this is for the audience also. There's a discussion in the book, and which was an important thing in Chandigarh. Should things look a certain way, or they have to be properly made in a certain way? Famously, for instance, in Corbusier's High Court, the arches of the High Court are actually hung, believe it or not, although you would think they hold up the roof. I know this is getting very specifically technical. And in Aditya Prakash's buildings, again, there was a constant battle between the economics of the engineers who said, well, we can just build this roof much cheaper if we throw a few trusses rather than actually follow the curve. So there's a schism between this appearance of modernism and being modernism. And can I go back to the question of those chairs, Sunil, that you brought up in this context? Those chairs which were made in the 1950s as part of the Chandigarh project. And they were made by the thousands and put into all, not just the chair, the furniture, let's just say, of Chandigarh furniture of the 50s and 60s, made by the thousands. And it was made in those huge numbers, basically because that was the cheap way to build the furniture, right? Off the shelf from a catalog furniture was much more expensive. The cheapest way was to design the furniture in the evening after you had done master planning and building design in the morning, and after in the evening after drinks you design furniture, and then that was made cheaply and locally and by the thousands. And it was frankly not designed to be last forever because it was quickly made. So 40, 50 years later, so again, how things are made and how they appear. 40, 50 years later, it's breaking down and it's being auctioned and being sold mostly to recyclers from the Chandigarh region who sell it off to the informal settlements or use it for firewood. But then it is taken to France and New York and Chicago and sold, restored, fixed. But those numbers that you're talking about, Sunil, which authenticate these as being appear visibly from that Indian moment, critically put those into evaluations of, I don't know, what is it, $30,000 a chair, or, you know, what is it? So is that, what is that? Is that preservation? What is it?
But I think that's exactly right, what you just said. These were made because it was the cheapest way to furnish these new offices. What makes them valuable today to sort of connoisseurs of modernism is precisely that handmade element of them. That they're both modern in design, but they have this craft hand element of them, which of course someone, you know, one forgets. I mean, Corbusier, you know, at the same time that he was building Chandigarh and the Unité d'Habitation, he was living in his 12 by 12 cabin, plywood and log cabin in Roquebrune. So he also, you know, he was split in his own mind between this valuation of the monumental and the sort of extra human, and then the very intimate and the sort of handmade, handcrafted. And I think, you know, what this furniture brings is that kind of the immediacy of that early moment of modernism, when you thought in terms of these, you know, rational, geometric forms, but you built them with all the mistakes and quirks of handcrafting and the marks of handcrafting. And I think that's precisely what in the 1990s, when you had a new kind of modernism, to use Mark's formulation, the new kinds of furniture available through the world, the India opening up to the world market and liberalization and so on, that became valuable to Indians in these offices who wanted to be, you know, out with this crafty type of stuff and get the kind of sleek aluminum, metal, you know, laminate, the modern stuff. And I think that's part of what was going on there.
And I think there was a big shift even in modernism. If you look at the work of Charlotte Perriand, who was the first designer for Corbusier's chrome and leather furniture, by the time she came back from Japan after the war, was entirely involved in building and craft wood, and very beautiful wood. And we find that in America too, with Noguchi and others.
But Mark, you were trying to jump in? Yeah.
There's also a factor which is the cult of the chair itself in modernism. You know, already Barons and me, you know, there was not a modern architect who didn't, you know, want to do a chair. And it becomes, if you will, a type of token of a certain type of theoretical performativity, you know, that sort of try to overcome the alienation of modernism by saying, listen, I can make you quote unquote comfortable or pretend comfortable or not. You know, that was sort of its outreach, you know, to its sort of the human that had been put under stress through the modernism themselves, right? So furniture had a powerful role in the narrative of modern architecture, and this sort of plays into that. I mean, then it becomes, you know, capitalized and commercialized, and and circulated it once again through the narratives, of neo-global, neo-modernist performativities.
Okay, so let's ask. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think this goes also back to the way in which the modernist making in India was not an industrial process. So it was this handmade. Whereas the Eameses in America were using industrial processes and trying to make it large, mass scale and cheap. In India, you had to actually artisanally make your kind of modern world, which, then to Indians in later decades looked, homey, sort of crafty. It was not, whereas to a Western connoisseur, this was kind of, the authentic modern. This was the handmade, but with this kind of design element. And I think that transvaluation of values, in a sense, is something that lies behind some of this shift.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.